I guess we can start. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our seminar series on policy implications of recent globalization research. I am Beata Javorcik. I am director of the CEPR's International Trade Program. And I have with me two of the seminar series co-organizers, Catherine Thomas from the London School of Economics and Dani Bahar from Harvard Kennedy School. Today we have the pleasure of having with us Professor Giovanni Peri. Giovanni is Professor of Economics at the University of California, Davis. He is also a research associate at the NBR and editor of the Journal of the European Economic Association. Giovanni is one of the leading figures when it comes to migration research, a very hot topic these days and not just for sort of recent decades. And today, Giovanni will talk about how skilled immigrants affect local productivity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. We have about an hour for the seminar. Giovanni will speak for about 45 minutes, and then he is happy to take questions. Please type your questions in the chat, and I will read them to our speaker at the end of the seminar. But please start typing questions as they occur to you. Don't wait until the very end. So Giovanni, it's wonderful to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Beata. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dani and Catherine, for the invitation. And so let me share the screen and let me get going with our presentation. So I am going to speak for 45 minutes and I have packed a lot of information. If you have maybe a question or better at the end, unless you really feel that you need to jump in. So today I will talk about skilled mobility. Why is the fact that people and skills are mobile very important for economies? And first, this will kind of make us think of migrant or immigrant, not just as changes in labor supply, but as changes in much more. And I will focus on three channels that I think are important, and my research has studied in the recent year, how science, technology, engineering, and math type of immigrants, so people who work and contribute in those areas, are important for productivity, how immigrants generate a response from firms in terms of investment, innovation, and what this means, and how immigrants themselves are entrepreneurs and what this means for their mobility. Before going into these three channels, which I will cover by discussing three of my research pieces, I want to tell those three important facts about immigration, because this helps set the stage. So the first fact, which is well established, is that while migration in the world has not really grown very much as a percentage of the population in the last 40 years, and migrants in this talk will be people who are born in a country and work and reside in another country. While overall the number of people as a percentage of the population has not grown a lot, there has been one channel, one corridor of migration which has increased substantially. And this is the people that go from less developed to developed countries. This is the graph that tells this story. If you take the three corridors of migration, one of people who move from advanced countries to advanced countries, the other people who move from developing country to developing country, and the third group of people who move from developing country to advanced country, and all counted as a percentage of the receiving economy population, you see that while these two flow remain relatively stable, the flow of people from developing to developed has almost doubled as a percentage of the population of the developed country. So this may not be very new to you. Immigration is important, has been growing, particularly for people moving from less developed to developed. And the two biggest destinations of people who move from less developed to developed are the US and Europe, and Western Europe in large part. And in both of these areas, this has been growing the same way. The US has a little bit more in percentage people that come from developing into the country, but Europe has been growing in a similar way. People then have this image of a lot of people who move from less developed to developed, but here I want to say two other facts that maybe change a little bit instead, the idea of who we think is moving. The second fact, which is very well established and very strong, is that there is a very strong and very clear positive selection of migrants in terms of their education and potentially other skills. I'm going to talk about education in a second, but there are several papers, and some of which I think is interesting research, that say that also migrants, on average, are not just more educated than people who don't migrate. They have a stronger tendency to be a risk taker. They have stronger non-cognitive type of characteristics, which we can characterize as adaptability, adjusting to new situation. There is a literature that says that migrants have better health than people that don't go. And the reason is that in many respects, people with some of these characteristics are the ones who have the highest benefit from migration, and possibly they have lower cost. The graph that normally I put up to show this is the relationship between the share of college educated among people who migrate relative to the share of college educated among the population that stays. These are dots for all non-developed countries. And as you see, this is the 45-degree line. If the dot is above, it means that the intensity of college educated of migrants is larger than the intensity of non-migrants. And you see that in some countries, the intensity of college education of migrants is massively larger than the intensity of non-migrant. India is a case is an example, a classic example that many people have in mind. Almost 70% of Indian abroad have a college education, while Indian in India have a much lower percentage of that. So mobility of incredibly high, sometimes incredibly high, in general, high-skilled, and people with certain characteristics. And then the third fact, before going into the economics of the effect, is that if you have to think of one sector and one area which is incredibly globalized, science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM, seems to be one of the most globalized, really. In particular, these people are very mobile, and I have to say in this, the US has a very big international role in attracting these people. Of course, the UK, of course, Canada, but in just the sheer number, the US has this magnet role, which is very, very strong for these people. And here, again, is the number that goes with it. In the US, immigrant in the recent censuses, as the share of the population are about 13.5%. There are more immigrants with a college degree. This share is about 17%. If you concentrate into college with a STEM degree, more than 22%. And then if you go into high degree or PhD with a STEM degree, about a third of the population of the people in the US are foreign born. And of course, even at the very, very top of science and engineering and technology, there are people, there is this huge overrepresentation of foreign born. So big flows of people with high skill. And so what would they do? So in the remaining 40 minutes here, I'm going to talk about how skilled immigrant impact productivity growth. And here I will use a paper on the US that uses a visa policy change, the H-1B visa policy, to identify this effect. Then I will talk about how skilled immigrant generate some response from firm, in particular in their investment and innovation. And here I will use a Swiss policy, which changed the inflow of immigrants. And then I will talk about how immigrants bring with themselves entrepreneurship and creation of firms. And here I will use an opposite example, an example of out-migration from a country and the implication that this could have on entrepreneurship there. So I told you that the US attracts a lot of STEM immigrant, high-skilled immigrant. Here is the sequence. This paper that I'm going to talk about looked essentially at the introduction of the H-1B, I will say in a second, which happened in 1990. This is how immigrants are as a share of employment, how they grow significantly, but how they grow as a share of STEM occupation. And again, here we classify STEM as those type of occupation which are at the top in employing degrees in STEM. But if you look at college educated in STEM, there has been a massive growth of the percentage of people who are foreign born. So for the US, and this is just the same graph in a graph, in the US, the growth of college educated STEM as a percentage of employment is all due to the inflow of immigrants. You can think that the growth from 1990 to 2010 of this group as a percentage of employment would have been zero if there had been no immigration and no inflow of foreign born. So as a consequence, this could be a very important factor. And when you just take a correlation here and you look across US metropolitan areas, how the growth of STEM foreigner is correlated to the growth in wages of US born college educated, or even to the growth of American non-college educated, you find this very strong, very positive correlation. Cities and areas where foreign STEM moved are also the cities and areas where the wage for American, especially for American college graduates, grew a lot. In this study, we try to go a little bit more into establishing a causation from the correlation that I just showed you. And the idea here is that we use the introduction of this H-1B visa program. The H-1B visa policy is the visa that essentially has allowed the largest part of skilled immigrants in the US in the last 30 years. It was introduced in 1990, and then it was subject to change in cap significantly between 1999 and 2000, and increase and then a decrease from 2005 to 2010. And so we use the changes of this cap over time, and then we interact, we distribute this change of cap based on the 1980 share of foreign STEM across US cities. And so we use in this paper what is come to be known as a Bartik or a shift share type of instrument. And now we know that we need to check many things in order for this to be a valid instrument. But the idea is that if you think of the introduction and expansion of H-1B as a policy that allow immigrants to know, the intensity with which this policy affected city for us has been determined by the share of STEM foreign worker in 1980. And if the share of foreign worker in STEM in 1980 was not so correlated with economic trends and productivity trends before 1980, or before 1990, sorry, which is when this policy was introduced, then we have a valid instrument not highly correlated with other shocks. Again, I don't want to go too technical. I'm very happy to talk more also about validity. But what we do here is we're going to run some analysis of how growth of some variable for native worker, and this will be college educated, non-college educated employment and wages, depend on the growth of STEM foreign worker in that city, standardized by the employment, growth as a percentage of employment. And then we will instrument this growth by saying, well, the inflow of STEM worker for each nationality N will depend from an initial level plus the accumulation of H-1B visa. Here is where the policy is going to enter, and this policy in aggregate, and we take it by country of origin, is relatively exogenous to individual city condition. And then this aggregate flow of Indians, Chinese, Filipinos, European of H-1B is going to be distributed across the city based on their 1980 presence of this STEM. And we're going to instrument this foreign STEM growth, use this instrument for total STEM growth in the city, and we will see what happens. And these are the main results from this type of analysis. And essentially, this coefficient, think that the dependent variable is a 1% increase. So an increase of STEM worker due to foreigners by 1% of the employment. This is a huge increase. It's the increase, the total increase that we had from 1990 to about 2010. And this has generated a very significant, or is correlated, but in two-stage least square, if you don't want to use yet a very causal language, still seems to be strongly associated even when you instrument with the growth of college-educated workers. And these are all different specifications of this of the regression that we have. Also positive, but more mildly correlated with growth of non-college educated, and not very correlated with changes in employment of these two groups. Also, although not very significant, they seem to also be associated with growth of native STEM wage workers. And so, again, if you look at this result as a whole in their totality, before going there, and these associations are significantly positive or zero. In the paper, we do several validity checks that you need to do with this instrument. In particular, you want to know that your instrument, your growth of foreign H1B foreign STEM is not correlated with pre-1990 trend. And so we correlate our instrument with the growth of wages, growth of employment in 1980, 1990, 1970, 1980. And we don't find much of a correlation. Moreover, we do some falsification. We cross-track this instrument based not on H1B visa, but on total immigration, thinking, oh, if it's just that city that attract immigrants or city that are growing fast, let's use instead of the total H1B, let's use the non-college immigrant. Or let's use the initial distribution of low-skilled rather than high-skilled. And these instruments are much weaker, and they don't essentially are not very correlated with our instrument, and they don't explain very much. And so in the end, we bring this, we consider this as evidence that immigration in the US was at least strongly and potentially causally correlated with growth of wages, in particular of highly skilled. Now, this joint effect, positive effect on wages with not much effect on employment implies, if you use a simple model, I don't even need to put up the production, but implies that this STEM immigration has done something to local productivity and maybe even to local productivity bias in favor of high skilled. And by inferring the productivity effect from wages and applying it to the average US, you find that this effect on productivity is really large. Here, this is a simple exercise, but what I want to say is that if we take that wage growth of high educated and less educated, you transform in total factor productivity and skill bias productivity, you can generate it at about 1/4 to 1/3 of the total productivity growth of the US, of the average US city over these 20 years was driven by immigrants. And this may seem gigantic, but think of a second of this model that say that scientists and engineers are the one that push science and productivity. And here the whole growth of scientists and engineers in the US. So if you have productivity growth in the US and a good chunk come from the fact that you have more people in science and technology, that chunk can be attributed essentially to immigrants. Again, I don't want to push too much this number. I just want to give you an idea of how big is this number for the US, how important was this inflow, and once you translate in potential effect on wages, how it was. However, this paper that I just presented is an interesting black box paper because it looks at immigrants and looks at wage effect, but it doesn't look at what immigrants do at a more detailed and a more fine level. So in order to do this, let me talk about this paper in which we look at Switzerland instead, because here we try to at least look much more carefully to how firms, on top of then labor market, respond to the inflow of immigrants. Here, what we use is a very different policy. And the policy comes from the fact that Switzerland, at some point, in particular between 1999 and 2002, removed first progressively and then completely any barrier of mobility between itself, between Switzerland and the EU. But in particular, there was a group of workers that followed a particular trajectory in this removal, and these are the cross-border workers. These are workers who live in Italy, France, and Germany, the bordering countries, and go and work to Switzerland. So we're going to use the particular timing and the suddenness of removal of barrier for cross-border worker and the particular nature of where foreign this cross-border worker work to answer the question, how did this greater availability of workers, which I will show you were skilled worker in reality, has affected employment and wages of Swiss native, but more interestingly in this paper, firm productivity, innovation, and capital accumulation investment, if you like, in Switzerland. So let me tell you a little bit about the timing of that we're going to use, and this is not as clean as you like. But there are essentially two phases in this liberalization. One in which before the reform there were a lot of constraints to mobility into Switzerland. Then mobility starts increasing, or constraints start being removed. And then what we call phase two is a phase in which, at least for our group, we have complete free entry. Now there are two types of immigrants in Switzerland: people who can move and be resident, residents. And for this, these are not different in what are the border region of Switzerland and non-border region. The policy for this group evolved in the same way. While for cross-border worker, actually, the policy evolved differently in border and non-border region. There were quite many restrictions before 1999. They were progressively removed in the phase 1 up to 2004, and then there was full free entry. So you can think of this, that if you compare essentially how many cross-border workers entered in regions of Switzerland from before, then during the transition, and then after, taking as a counterfactual the area where this worker could not go, and this worker could not go in any other region until after 2007, you can think of establishing the effect of relaxing the constraint and then allowing free entry as a difference in difference effect between a region that received a lot of these cross-border workers and region that did not receive very much. There is an even more interesting thing about cross-border workers. These are the cross-border region of Switzerland in gray or light gray. And the gray is defined as the time to cross the border. How far is a municipality from the border, accounting on where you can cross the border. And what it turns out, actually, which is very interesting, is that these cross-border workers are incredibly concentrated very close to the border. So this is the density, so the employment share in the firms of Switzerland of these cross-border workers from 0 to 50 minutes of commute away from the border. And the different colors are in what year? The year before our reform, which are 94 and 98. So cross-border workers have always been very concentrated. And I will tell you, essentially between 0 and 15 kilometers from the border. There have been some between 15 and 30 kilometers, and then essentially none passed. And in non-border region, essentially there have never been this cross-border worker. Because, you know, if you live in Italy and commute to Switzerland, Europeans don't commute for much more than 30 minutes each way normally, and that's what defines this shape. Now, not only you notice this, but also you notice the little increase in the first phase. 2004 generates a little bit of an increase of this group, and then the full liberalization generates a big jump of this group. So our identification here uses the fact that there is this temporal variation of closing or restricted and then opening up substantially to cross-worker border. And there's a spatial variation that over 30 kilometers, essentially, no one of these cross-border workers went before or after, but within 30 kilometers did. And so we used this policy reform that happened in 99 and was implemented between 99 and 2002 in order to see what is the impact of comparing the pre and post reform in the very close region to the one next to them, but far enough. So let me establish a few facts about this reform. And first, let me tell you just, again, I'm going to show you a graph about this reform, but just to have an idea, the type of analysis we do is we take a variable either for worker or for firms, and we regress it on a dynamic effect, a year effect before the reform, during, and then after the reform. And then we break into 3 areas this outcome. One in the very close region that I told you are the one, as I will show you, which receive most of this group. Then in the region which are maybe mildly treated between 15 and 30. And then as control, we either use the region above 30 kilometers, including the border region above 30 that don't have, or we use the non-border region, or we use a similar matching. So I'm going to show you the impact near the border, very near the border, at an intermediate relative to what was happening far away from the border. So here is the first 2 facts of this reform. And again, these 2, the blue and the red, the difference between the blue and the red line is that we choose a different control, either outside of the border or 30 kilometers plus. But the effect is very clear. First, in terms of immigrants, this region, which were at 0 to 15 minutes, received the first little increase of these immigrants in the transitional phase, which is when some of these movement constraints were removed. And then in full liberalization, they clearly have a big increase of this total cross-border worker. But sorry, if you add up cross-border and all other immigrants, you see that this jump is only observed for cross-border workers. So they drive the total effect of increase of immigrants. This is the effect at 15 to 30 minutes from the border. And essentially, we standardize to 0 the effect past 30, which we actually test. You can test the effect on 30, 40, 40, 50. And essentially, this effect past 30 are 0. And here what you see is that if you split between highly educated, this is the inflow of highly educated, and this is the inflow of less educated, highly means some college or more, you see that this was clearly a big inflow of high college educated workers. Let me look at the number here. This is an increase by 10% of the labor force in this area. So it's a big jump. Remember, the Mariel boat lift that everybody knows, if you've studied this, was an increase by 7% of the labor force. The inflow of Jewish Israeli into, or Russian Israeli into Israel, which is another super studied case, is about 10% increase in the labor force. So this is a very large jump in the local population. And if you look at high skilled, as a percentage of high skilled, is a massive jump, 20 to 25% more high skilled in the course of 3-4 years were available to Swiss firms. So first, even in this study, we started looking at the effect on average wages, average employment, and wages of college and non-college and employment. And here you see that on average, you don't see much of an impact of the reform, of the opening up of the border this is all for the very closest region. Now I'm showing you the time dynamic for the 0 to 15 group. You don't observe very much. If you split though between college and non-college, you observe this very interesting effect that actually the wage of college educated in those regions increased. The wage of non-college, this is never significant, is 0, a little negative, but not significant. And the employment is some up and down, but not much. If anything, again, a little bit maybe of a positive effect on the highly skilled, but not very stable. So if you look at this and you think about this, the standard canonical model will never explain this effect because you have an inflow of highly skilled, and what you observe is that the wage of highly skilled increase. Not much happens for the low skilled, not much happens to employment, but the wage increase. And so it must be the case that this cross-border worker must have had some impact on productivity, on maybe investment, physical capital, something that benefited in particular the high-skilled in there. And that's why we look at firms. And here, in the back of our mind, we have a model in which we have a framework in which a labor market can have frictions. And some of these firms in Switzerland could have been constrained in finding the right high skilled. And so as a consequence of that, they were not, they had an excess maybe capacity or an inability of hiring the right type of workers. And then when this inflow of highly skilled increases the matching probability, increases the possibility of hiring the right match for the skill, to find the right type of workers, and this might have loosened the tightness of the labor market and might have increased the productivity of the firm as a sector. And so to inquire this, let me show you 5 facts that we look and 5 things that we look for Switzerland that tell us that firm likely responded by hiring this worker, by rearranging by increasing the innovation and research intensity of their company with effect, probably on the productivity also of highly skilled. So first, if you look at where these workers were hired and you split the sectors between high-tech manufacturing and knowledge-intensive service and low-tech and low-knowledge intensive, you see that all this, the increase in employment, full-time equivalent employment, happens in these 2 high-tech. So sectorially, they go and increase employment in this group. And if in this 4 types of firms, you split how this growth in employment was driven by foreigners or by natives, you see that really are the foreigners that generate this. There is no displacement of native, it looks like. There is not a decrease in their employment, but the growth in employment is driven by foreign work. Second, here in this Swiss data, we have a very interesting thing, which is we have a survey before the reform in which firm had stated themselves, individual firm, if they experienced high skill shortage, moderate skill shortage, or no skill shortage. And essentially, they also, kind of in this larger survey, also said if they were hampered or not hampered by the lack of highly specialized productive workers. So we split the firms into this group. This is the effect on the border, the firm near the border, on the effect on productivity, which is value added per worker. And we observe that of all the firms near the border, the one who are mostly benefited by this reform are the one who said before the policy that they experience high skill shortages, the intermediate less and the even lower less. And in particular, the productivity growth is significantly larger in terms of value added per worker in the firm that said that they were highly hampered by the lack of specialized skilled workers before the reform. So there is something to this imperfection of labor market, in which if you have a smaller labor market, you have a harder time. And so these are agglomeration economy, if you want, that improve the matching of workers and firm, and this seems to be particularly evident here. Then this, on the other hand, this just split the effect on productivity between other sector, high tech and high tech service. And again, you see that the effect of productivity are mostly there. And here we split company in terms of explicitly responding, we feel, R&D shortages before the reform. And this is the effect on productivity, on product innovation. Actually, we have some measure of product innovation. This is the effect on patenting at the level of firm. And so you see, and this is the effect on having more R&D workers. And you see for all the firms that said that we have high R&D shortages, these effects are significantly positive. There is not much process innovation in either case, but for those firms is very clear. So, and finally, if you take more explicitly this measure of innovation as patent applied by firms or R&D personnel, share of R&D employment in firms, first let me show you the dynamics over time. If you take the firms close to the border relative to the rest, there seems to be some increase in patenting application using either control group at 30 or beyond the border. And if you split companies between companies which are close to the border, 15 minutes, 15 to 30 and more than 30, and you look at their researcher as a percentage of employment increased, you see that after the reform, only for the firm really close to the border, this percentage increased massively and mostly increased because the cross-border worker themselves increased. Swiss researcher, which is this darker, didn't change very much over time as a percentage, but this significant increase of cross-border worker put this group of firms near the border at an advantage. And finally, if you look at if this more worker generate more firm entry, so this could be capital creation or firm creation, we see again that if you look at the area really close to the border, we observe a clear effect in increasing firm entry in the transition and in the post-liberalization, and we don't find much of evidence of a firm exit. And again, this will be a response of capital and of new firms to this group. Of course, in the paper, we have to do a ton of other things because Switzerland also became more open in terms of trade with the rest of Europe. And we do a lot of things showing that this type of effect seems to be pretty common to trading and non-trading company, pretty common in trading and non-trading sector. Trading, increasing openness to trade did a lot for Switzerland, but this particular effect concentrated very near the border seemed to us, at least after having done and tried to cover all our bases, that it's significantly affected by immigration, this particular opening up to international cross-border work. So overall, in this paper, we learn that there is this strong evidence that these cross-border workers seem to have had an impact on the productivity of firms and of workers through the increase in salaries. And firm invested, innovated more, and expanded as a consequence of this. And in particular, firm who had maybe were more constrained in terms of skills and ability to match with the worker before the reform seemed to be the one that benefited the most. So the last part that the last thing that I want to touch is, okay, then more immigrants generate opportunity, maybe productivity, but do they themselves create more of this firm? Are they really a kind of entrepreneurial more than non-migrant? And here, again, there is a long literature that in a descriptive way seems to say that immigrants have a higher probability of creating firms. A lot of this is actually US-based. This literature shows that in the US, immigrants are very highly entrepreneurial and innovative. And again, if you go for a theory and an explanation, the reason that bring you to go away from your country and move, which are maybe you are a little bit less risk averse, you are more willing to take risk, you are more willing to adjust, to adapt. Maybe these are also good characteristics to open a firm, to create a firm. And so the selection of migrants can also generate a selection towards entrepreneurship. Before telling you about my paper, I want to show you this figure that comes from a recent paper published last year by Pierre Azoulay and co-author on the American Economic Insight that shows in a very interesting way, this is the plot of the how many firms were created per million of people by native and immigrant in the US, a different level of size of the firm. How many firms with 1 employer, with 3 employers, with 100 employers, with 1,000 employers. This is in the log scale vertically, and so it's compressed. But this difference between native and immigrant, so there are many more native per million, many more immigrant per million people that create firms at all level of size, even gigantic firm. And again, I said this is compressed, but this is a threefold difference. Only 2.7 natives out of 1,000 start a firm with 1 worker, but 7.7 native out of 1,000 non-native immigrants start a firm. And here, 7 on 7 migrants out of 1 million start a firm which will have more than 1,000 workers, and only 2.8 natives out of 1 million. So in a correlational term, there seems to be a clear fact that immigrants seem to be creating more firm, seems to be entrepreneurial at a higher rate. So in this final paper that I will mention, we look at kind of the opposite thing. We are struck by the fact that Italy, that has become fully integrated with Europe in terms of labor market since the European Union was created, when experiencing a very deep crisis, a very deep, recession coming from the Great Recession of 2008, experienced a massive outflow of people. And I will show you in a second, this outflow were a lot of young and a lot of highly educated people. And what we do is we're going to ask, did Italy as a consequence lose a lot of potential firms that would have been created in Italy? And we use this administrative data on Italy and on firm creation in Italy in order to assess the impact of this. So let me show you the proportion of this flow. So while there have always been outflow of people from Italy, this is the flow as a percentage of the group. And you see that in 2009-10, this things spikes and is much larger. It almost triple in percentage of the group from 2009 to 2015, and the outflow of less educated also increases, but much less. And so what we do here is we are going to use the distribution of out-migration by municipality, actually by local labor system in Italy. We look at the variation of a performance in new firm created in the period during and post this big outflow for each labor system, and first we regress it on the cumulated flow of out migrants from that local labor market, standardized by the population. and then control for other things and put a province fixed effect. The province is an aggregation of maybe 4 or 5 of these labor markets, so is a big control for common trend. And then just in reverse as before, we say, okay, of course, people live from a place and bad things happen to the place if there is a depression, but we're going to use the differential pool, we call it, of across municipality in Italy, is because back in 2000, we could measure back in 2000 how many Italians from that municipality were residing in other European or world country. And we distribute essentially, according to this share, how much the country where these Italians are, which create a network potentially to attract new Italian, how much that economy did better than Italy in the period of 2015-2008. So how much it grew. It turns out, again, in this shift share, here, very small technical, and I'll go to the results in a second, what matters really is the variation of this share of Italian who were in Germany and Switzerland. Germany and Switzerland are the country that received the large part, and the UK as a third, large part of this flow of migrants in this period. But we created this, again, potential easiness to migrate from each municipality, which depend on how many people previously migrated in 2000. We test with this Goldsmith-Pinkham criteria that this is not very correlated with other stuff. And here it is what the local labor system. This is the actual intensity of emigration in the period that we consider, and this is the intensity of emigration predicted by our shift share. You notice that they're not identical. In particular, the shift share over-predicts migration from the south a little bit, because in the past more Italian moved from the south, while the recent migration was a lot from the north. But given that we only use the within province variation, we will notice that there is quite a correlation in the within province variation. Some dark area are dark in the predicted part relative to the light. And so we use this. And here is the intuition of the result. If you separate municipality, local labor system between the one which have a high emigration predicted and those that you have low emigration predicted, you see that these two, and then you look at the number of firm created in each one of these two group, the net firm, you see that these two group actually didn't behave very differently up to 2009, and then they clearly diverge, and they diverge in a way in which the municipality that had high emigration start to produce significantly less firm. This was a big recession, so firm creation went down in most of the places, but it went down significantly more in the places where there was this outflow of Italian abroad. And here is the result, and here is the key takeaway in terms of numbers. The change in the stock of firm corresponding to one standard deviation, one more standard deviation of emigrant, is a reduction in the creation in the total stock of firm by 0.43%. And the interesting part is that all of these effects come from less firm creation, which is what you expect if you lose young college educated who would be entrepreneur, will create firms, not by firm distraction. Also, we developed this in the paper, and we try to say, oh, also the fact that it was not massive firm distraction means also that it's not that the recession was dramatically different across this company. And we check that the pre-2008 trend in many of these features is not very correlated. But just to give you a number, average emigration was about 1.7% of the population of the local labor system. One local labor system that had a 1.7% higher emigration had a 5% lower firm creation, about 200 new firm. It lost, quote unquote, 200 new firm over these 5 years that we are looking. And the average size of this local labor market are about 50,000 people. So big effect, particularly big because if you look at young firms, what we call young firms are firms created by people who are young, under 40, that's our definition of young here. Or if you look at the effect on startups, those are significant. And of course, here in startup, you have a much smaller number because there are much fewer high-tech startup relative to all firms. But as a percentage of all the startup, of high-tech startup, this decline was almost less 20%, was so large that we kind of, we're not sure. And in the paper, we decompose what is just due to the fact that people go away, and when people go away, there are fewer firms. How much is due to the fact that you select a group that goes away, which is very entrepreneurial, and how much is due to the fact that there may be some spillover with fewer people creating firm, other people in Italy. And we find that a third of the effect is the selection. These people were more likely to be entrepreneur. And another third is this externality that other people seem to be less willing to create firm when they are not. Okay. It's about 45 minutes since I started, and so we have some time, so let me conclude. So essentially, this quick overview of the research that I gave you seems to say that immigrants have very important role in productivity, in firms, in innovation, and in entrepreneurship. And many of the recent papers on this topic have used some policies that have changed the inflow of immigrants, and they've looked at the impact. Of course, the big challenge here is always to identify a causal effect. And I would say that if maybe you don't take any single study at face value, the aggregation of many of them, some of which try to make a real effort to get to causality, should tell you that there is something here. And finally, I think that the mobility of high-skilled worker in the world is going to be a very important force for the economy and the productivity of many countries in the world. And although we didn't spend too much time, this seems to go in the direction that if you let people from different places and who are selected in a certain way, openness, variety of skill is important and good for growth. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for this fascinating presentation. We already have some questions. So let me start with a question from Alan Winters. Yes. His question is about people relocating from Switzerland to neighboring regions after the policy change. And Alan talks here about the example of Geneva, where many workers of international organizations tend to live in France because it's simply cheaper to go there, to live there.
Sorry, so did the people, did the number, is the question whether some of these cross-border are just people who used to live in Switzerland and move out and then recommute back?
Yes, so people who were considered to be residents prior to policy change.
That's a good. So we actually look at the mobility response in municipality from municipality of Switzerland. So one thing that we were worried is that maybe some of these effects are driven of better employment, better wage on the border, were driven by some Swiss people who themselves maybe would have moved towards this region. So if there was an increase in this region of other Swiss, we didn't find much of the relocation as an impact. We really found that this effect on the Swiss people was an effect sort of on increasing employment. Then we look at other type of immigrant, the non-cross-border worker, and we looked at whether cross-border worker crowded out or crowded in some of the other immigrants. And actually, we found a little evidence that they crowded in the sense that in places where there were more of this cross-border hired, there were also a little bit more of other type of immigrant hired. That's most of what we did in terms of trying to identify our effect at the very border relative to nearby region. Geneva in our data set I don't think it plays a massive. We did some test eliminating some big cities that are close to the border, and we were worried that they had different labor market. But I don't think. So I'm not sure how big is this phenomenon. I don't think it affects too much our result. I'll have to think a little bit more if really there is kind of a systematic role. We could not look at who the Italians and who the Germans were if they were relocated people, but maybe we'll think more about that.
Thank you on behalf of Alan. And now let me give the floor to Danny and then Catherine.
Giovanni, this is fabulous, and I'm a big fan of your research, so I just remember that again. Thank you for that. So two questions that are a bit big picture, but I wanted to ask you, because I struggle with them myself. One question is that, I mean, the work you showed today and your previous work, particularly the one on Denmark, I think we show, I mean, you basically show a lot of complementarities between high-skilled migrants and natives, and low-skilled migrants and natives in the case of Denmark. I wonder how much we know about, I mean, complementarities go both ways, right? So intuitively, you would also think that low-skilled or fundamental workers immigration would actually play a big role in complementarities of high-skilled workers. Like, you know, a doctor needs needs a taxi driver, and an engineer needs, right? So I wonder what's the stage of the literature there, if you have insights or if you've seen something, if you, that's one question. The question number two, which is even more complicated, and I don't want to put you in the spot, it's kind of difficult, but it's more policy. And as a scholar of migration myself, like one of the questions I asked to myself at night is like, you know, with all this massive evidence we have, which is indisputable, and in so many aspects, how come we haven't been able to translate, we economists, I guess, this into the public perception of migration? Like, what are we not doing right?
Yes, thank you, Gianni. Those are two excellent questions. So let me tell you my thoughts about the first. So I definitely think that one important dimension of complementarity is this one that you are saying, that people who have different skills and they do different tasks are both needed in production and they can contribute. I like very much, as you know, this literature that try to go even a little bit more in detail and not just separate people by schooling, but by type of occupation they do, by task that they do on the work. And there is evidence even there, right, that there is this interesting mechanism at work in which the immigrant who do have some of the manual, specialize more in the manual type of job and tasks, then are complementary with the communication and push native into the communication job and task. I think this is at work. I think even more interestingly, connected with this recent labor literature that says that also machines are complementary in a different way with different workers. Mechanization has increased the productivity of a group of workers, which is the high-skilled, cognitive intensive, and we have a lot of immigrants there. It has replaced the productivity of routine intensive, but routine intensive has never been where many immigrants have been, and it has been relatively neutral to the manual job, so that manual workers are still in high demand. The manual in-place type of jobs are still important and increasing in employment. So I see that literature is very interesting for immigration, because we should ask going forward, how does an immigrant labor force and the technology going to shape a labor market? Which one are going to be the job that immigrants are going to do in large part, and in which essentially they have a comparative advantage, they generate some benefit? What are the jobs that machines are going to do? And as a consequence, how is sort of the labor market going to be shaped by natives? I think that literature is very interesting and is very important, and looks again, you know, in some paper, I really think hard about the interaction between technology, skills of immigrant and local, and I think that's a productive area. And then the other one is how does offshoring, globalization, moving jobs abroad interact with the presence of immigrants? They are also doing some type of job which are complementing some of the natives, and so the part of the studies that look at how offshoring some job or some jobs are easier to offshore, other are easier for immigrants to take, and other are the one that the native will have, also will shape the labor market. So I didn't give you an answer, but I told you what are the areas in this complementarity and connection, which I think are more interesting, where we're learning something, and where we're learning that the benefit and the complementarity of immigrants is really interesting and special. And kind of naturally moving to your second question, so by now there is this interesting literature that start to figure out, or try to figure out and think, where does this misperception and sometimes prejudice towards immigrant come, right? There are this paper, you know, Stancheva and then the late Alesina, looking at how people misperceive constantly facts about immigrants, and why? Is it information? Is it the type in which information is presented? Obviously, we have not done a good job as economists in bringing, in making known what we know. It does seem, though, from this literature that people seems to attach a lot of value to these other aspects, which are not the economic aspect, the cultural, the change that they bring. There is this paper by Carl Dustman and Pressman that show that the opinion of people about immigration is more shaped by how they feel immigrants are changing their neighborhood than how they feel immigrants are impacting the economy. So there could be a world in which, even if we convince people that economically there is a ton of sense in having more immigration, people would say there are other reasons, and they're cultural, and they are I don't know, this type of ideological type of reason, and we will not. I am with you, Danny, 100%. We need to do a much better job. We need to talk about this. Eventually, the scientists have succeeded in convincing us that climate change is real, and that most of the people now think is human generated. I don't know, maybe that's a tall task, but we should be able to eventually convince at least that from an economic point of view makes a lot of sense to have a little bit more immigrants.
Hi, Giovanni. Thank you very much for the talk. I found it really, really fascinating. I actually wanted to ask a question that was very similar to Danny's question, but not quite this. Danny's first question, but not quite the same. So this figure that 1/3 of all productivity growth in large urban areas can be attributed to foreign STEM workers is so interesting. And I wondered if in your data you had the ability to sort of look at the pull factors, so because issuing H-1B visas is a costly undertaking. Can you see how much of it is coming from large tech companies or large firms in general? These are, when you think about the nature of the complementarities, it's not just complementarities with native workers of different skill levels, but really you need large firms to be bringing in the workers. And is that something that you have thought of, you see?
Yes. So first, I really think that productivity effect is so large that it needs to go a little bit beyond just the complementarity with native. There needs to be, so there we tried in some paper to show that really immigrants push the technology frontier, innovate. So you need kind of innovation. You need both innovation from the theoretical in the academia, in patenting, in application. There is massive evidence that the big player, large firms, are much more relevant in terms of patenting, of innovation, and large firms are also relatively big player in attracting the high-skilled foreigner. There is a big literature that says that large universities are also a very important player, actually. So in some other type of research, we're trying to think of how much the inflow of students, of undergraduate and graduate students, who then will become a lot of these innovator, is going to impact. So the US data are very clunky in terms of finding, having access to an employer-employee joint data. And, William Kerr has done a fantastic job in doing this. I have done much more micro work, in a sense, in some European country where these data are a little bit more available. But what we have in terms of firm, so in terms of firm, in the US, I would say that these H-1B papers that we wrote seem to identify that the high size, high productivity firm are the big player there. However, some mid-size can really also rely significantly on that. When we try to use a lottery of visa to introduce some uncertainty and look at just the impact of having or not having an H-1B. And although it was a little hard, the evidence there was that mid-size firms seems to, maybe larger firm can find other way of getting immigrant here or outsourcing their job. Mid-size firm may have an harder time to substitute and replace a worker. And there is this work by Britta Glennon that shows that firms that get more of this H-1B, they have to offshore less of their high tech. And so, yes, more immigrant means that some of these big firms have an important role, that innovation is one of the channels for sure. But I think we shouldn't forget, together with large firms, the role of university and colleges in attracting, generating, and then spinning off this worker. That's another very interesting area of research.
Great.
Giovanni, if I may, one last question. Do you think that smaller countries tend to benefit more from inward migration? Because to create a startup ecosystem or high-tech ecosystem, you need a minimum number of people with certain skills, and you may not simply have enough natives to do that.
Yes, so I think it's a good point. I think small countries, I mean, the example of Switzerland could be really one of those examples. A small country may have a harder time to find a variety and a combination of skills. I have heard anecdotally this a little bit, that also some relatively large country, maybe so, if you talk to high-tech companies in Silicon Valley, you realize that Japan, for instance, right now seems to be at a clear disadvantage in terms of finding some of these skills. Japan is a large country, but it's a country with almost no immigration at all. And so although you have a lot of local skilled workers, you don't have that variety of team of ideas that you may have instead in a place like California, where 30% are foreign born and they are from all over the world. So in a sense, a small and very homogeneous country, both could be a little bit at a cost when they try to create these startups, because idea, team, variety seems to be important in that area. So I think the answer is yes.
Thank you very much. I think we are out of time. So Giovanni, thank you very much for an excellent talk, a talk packed with lots of findings, which are not only convincing, but also policy relevant, which is the purpose of our seminar series. So thank you very much. And we look forward to your future work on the subject of immigration.
Thank you, Beata. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Catherine. It was my pleasure being here. A lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.